This is Hunter Keegan back with another installment for the Bipolar Recorder Project. A lot of new listeners have been coming across the show lately through various paths, including YouTube and word of mouth. There's a wonderful cult following of people who have been listening to this podcast since day one, but it occurred to me that since we've experienced new growth and there's a lot of previous content released already, that it might be helpful to do a quick recap of the mission as we approach 5 full years of mental health podcasting and outreach. I wanted to start by telling new listeners who I am. My name is Hunter. I'm from the great state of Virginia. I dabble in many creative moonlight pursuits, but I primarily consider myself a writer and musician. Before I launched Bipolar Recorder, I was releasing music with a band called Last Known Images, and I was writing about mental health topics. I had an article published by National Alliance on Mental Illness in December of 2019, and then I independently published a book called My Brain is Trying to Kill Me in 2020. My Brain is Trying to Kill Me, my first book, was the inspiration for Bipolar Recorder. Basically, after that book came out, readers began emailing me and encouraging me to continue writing and speaking about mental health and to also expand the scope of what I was doing. For new listeners, Bipolar Recorder essentially is a long-form interview podcast where I speak with various people from all backgrounds about their experiences with serious mental illness, also known as SMI. There are already dozens of interviews released to date. I strongly recommend checking them out because we've had a ton of great guests over the years. Obviously, the show primarily focuses on bipolar disorder, but we've had guests discuss many other forms of mental health condition as well, including PTSD and schizoaffective disorder. As you can see, if you scroll through the podcast feed, we have several dozen official installments that have already been released. Many of them are interviews with other people, but at this point there are also a fair number of self-check-ins where I share about important mental health topics that are personally impacting me. Since part of my mission is to share authentically and transparently about mental illness and how it impacts people, I often talk about my own ongoing journey with bipolar disorder and maintaining stability and recovery. If you want, you can read all about my own journey with bipolar disorder in my books. All of my published work is autobiographical in nature, and within it, I share about the intense days I lived through as a young adult reckoning with what at the time was untreated, serious mental illness. I have 3 books published. You can find them on Amazon if you search my name, Hunter Keegan. And there also will be links in the show description if you'd like to click them and check them out. One of the books is a short autobiographical story called Alice Head Creeps, and the other 2 are full-length memoirs. Again, My Brain is Trying to Kill Me, published in 2020, and the latest, Happy Valleys, A Bipolar Journey, which was published in 2025. All 3 of these books focus on my experiences as a psychology student at Penn State University, where I graduated in 2014. They depict my debaucherous and degenerate, as I often call it, lifestyle that ultimately resulted in a bipolar 1 diagnosis and landed me in a psychiatric hospital when I was 22 years old. These books are very R-rated, and they've been well received by all sorts of audiences, both internationally and here in America. And they're not traditional self-help narratives either. They're more like depictions of formative experiences in my young adult life and the aftermath of them. I often remind people that I'm not trying to cast myself as a role model throughout my work. Music and the creative arts in general are extremely important to me. In addition to the mental health outreach career, I've never stopped releasing original music. I actually have a new album coming out soon. It's called Autumn, I Still Feel You, and it should be out on Bandcamp and other streaming sites in August, so keep an eye out for that. Strangely, more people have heard my music than have heard the Bipolar Recorder podcast or read my books. My solo musical work, so to find that, search Hunter Keegan on Spotify and Bandcamp and Apple Music, etc., etc. It has something of a underground following, I guess. My original music is frequently incorporated throughout this podcast soundtrack, so if you've listened to the podcast, you've actually heard a little bit of my music already. It's incorporated into the intro music and the various, interludes and segues throughout each installment of the show. Because I'm a musician, there's occasional crossover content, like the recent guitar pedal promo video I released on YouTube. If you care to check out the @Bipolar Recorder YouTube channel, you'll see my demonstration video of something called the Dazatronics Big Fuzz console. So that was pretty cool. I love guitar gear. I even personally modified a Telecaster last year and dubbed it the Bipolar Caster. You can see that featured in the YouTube videos as well at the Bipolar Recorder channel @Bipolar Recorder. And you can hear it on my next album, of course, the aforementioned Autumn, I Still Feel You. I wanted to provide all of that context to give you more of an idea of what I'm about as a Moonlight creative type. I do say moonlight because currently I'm holding down a traditional day job as well. Unfortunately, I have to do this to keep my creative projects sustainable. But my primary passion and focus in life for the last several years has been mental health outreach. Using writing, music, and the spoken word to articulate mental illness in a way that people can relate to and resonate with is my mission in life. On that note, it's important to define not only my mission, but the mission of Bipolar Recorder Project. Bipolar Recorder Project started as a humble podcast in 2021, but by 2026, it's evolved into what I can only describe as a multimedia mental health storytelling mission. It now involves an online peer support community, a YouTube channel with a documentary film and other video content, public speaking events, and the podcast. So what are the goals? What's the point of all of this? What are we actually trying to do here? The mission is multifaceted. 1, we seek to illuminate the human experience of living with serious mental illness. That means sharing stories about our lives in a format where we can speak openly and authentically about both successes and missteps. I seek to provide an opportunity for people to share their personal truths about living with mental illness. 2, we are advocating for patient rights and informed consent. This is an underlying theme throughout much of the releases so far. While sometimes professional mental health treatment can be very beneficial, treatment is not always safe and effective. And it's important that people know the risks of any medical intervention, including psychiatric interventions or care that they're receiving. So on Bipolar Recorder, I seek to platform stories from all perspectives and walks of life, including perspectives that involve negative stances on mental health treatment. Why do I mention this specifically? Because when I started Bipolar Recorder in 2021, I had no idea that there was something that exists called the anti-psychiatry movement. Over the years, Bipolar Recorder, probably in part because of the notorious Red Skull logo, has been described by some critics as being anti-psychiatry. But for the record, I don't think all psychiatrists are bad. As a matter of fact, I work with a pretty good psychiatrist right now, myself, but I do believe that there is a valid controversy to be discussed in modern healthcare when it comes to advocating for patient rights and informed consent and thinking critically about mental health treatment. The third facet that I want to highlight is also known as the third element of Bipolar Recorder Project: community. The online peer support community that has formed around Bipolar Recorder is one of the most important elements of our mental health outreach mission. This includes the university outreach presentations I do, where I encourage students to brainstorm how to support mental well-being in their local communities. One important component of this is also recognizing the boundaries of peer support and not attempting to provide medical advice or other intervention that would be better suited for the consultation of an ethical and qualified healthcare professional. So in other words, part of that third element is also knowing the boundaries. So in other words, that would be, for example, not attempting to provide crisis support if you're not qualified to do so, and not providing medical guidance if you're not qualified to do so, because that would not be an appropriate form of peer support. A fourth overarching aspect of Bipolar Recorder's mission is promoting creativity and self-expression. So I've platformed a lot of creative artists on the show. I think that creativity and being artistic is super important, whatever that looks like for someone. So exploring creative outlets for therapeutic healing and incorporating art and self-expression into recovery, I think is definitely a aspect of all of this that is definitely worth mentioning as one of the recurring main themes present throughout the Bipolar Recorder outreach. I hope this all provides more context and clarity around Bipolar Recorder and what it represents. Now, I'd like to do something that I should have done about 2 months ago, which is to finally roll the audio from the latest outreach presentation that I did at Penn State University back in April. I already uploaded the video from one of the presentations I did that day to the YouTube channel at Bipolar Recorder. So you can find a video of one of the presentations from April on YouTube. And then this audio is from the second presentation that I did that day. And I'm going to roll that right now. I think it will give new listeners even more context about me and the mission, and it's also a great example just in general of the real-world outreach that has become a key aspect of Bipolar Recorder Project. So I hope you enjoy. Let's go ahead and give it a listen. In the first 30 seconds or so, you'll hear Dr. Weimer introducing me to the class, and then I conduct the presentation and answer a few questions from students at the end.
Welcome. So, it's a fun day. You're not graded on anything. You can only get extra points, right? Extra credit here. So, for today's class, there's a series of discussion questions you can respond to. Remember, extra credit is due at midnight. Regular credit is due at class time. Also, I posted this on Canvas and the Bipolar Recorder documentary that I was in. I posted that on Canvas as well. So Hunter was a student here at Penn State, graduated December 2014. You were a student of mine in Psych 470.
Yes, sir.
In ancient times in the Nursing Science Building 12 years ago. Yeah. And so you and I have just kept in touch ever since, mostly because of your first book. And I'm a character in your first book. Yes. So anyway, so you sent me a copy of your first book, and we've been communicating ever since. And so he comes in every semester to talk to my students about just mental illness advocacy and your podcast and so on.
Yeah.
And so what we're going to do is talk for maybe 40 minutes and then have maybe a 10-minute discussion.
So I hope this will be a nice kind of chill guest presentation where, like Dr. Weimer said, maybe you get some extra credit. The title of this presentation is Lived Experience and New Perspectives. My name, again, is Hunter. My full name, Hunter Keegan. I'm the host and producer of Bipolar Recorder Project. I've been coming up to Penn State University to do these guest presentations since about October 2023. Like Dr. Weimer was saying, that all started just simply through networking and having taken a class. So let me tell you a little bit more about the goals of this presentation. We are going to try to get through this maybe within 20 to 30 minutes, so we have plenty of time for a question and answer period, and also just like if there's any comments, we can take those questions at the end.
So we're going to be discussing how mental illness impacts communities. We're going to explore one example of a serious mental illness and my personal journey with it. And we're also going to brainstorm new mental health resources in your community. Here's a bit more about myself. So I am 33 years old. I graduated from Penn State in December of 2014. So yeah, 12 years ago, coming up on it, is kind of terrifying to think about. But
Wait till you get to 50.
Yeah, we'll cross that bridge once we get there.
Yeah.
But I'm currently living down in Roanoke, Virginia. Originally, I'm from the Washington, D.C. area. Like I said, I studied at Penn State. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology, class of 2014. My professional background, which I don't tend to go into a ton of detail about with the nature of this work, I try to keep a bit of a professional boundary between the mental health outreach and the day jobs that I have or have had over the years. But yeah, it has to do with industrial organizational psychology related stuff. I've worked in social services. I also have worked in corporate talent acquisition. I'm currently doing something else, but the majority of my career experience is in those domains. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1 in 2015, and that really derailed me for quite a while after being quite successful as a student here at the university. And since 2021, I've been leading this independent mental health outreach mission called Bipolar Recorder Project. And I'll tell you, of course, about the bipolar disorder stuff in about maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll tell you more about Bipolar Recorder as well at the very end of the presentation. What exactly is mental health advocacy? That's what a lot of people call what I'm doing here right now, today. They call this mental health advocacy. And as best I can tell, it's a general term that's being thrown around. I used this working definition myself. This isn't like an official definition, but essentially, it's a term used by many individuals and organizations to describe publicly sharing about mental health and resources for supporting people with mental illness. It can take a lot of different forms, ranging from individual conversations that you may have with friends or family members, or it could be things like media content. I used an example in the first presentation I did today of Carrie Fisher's memoir, Wishful Drinking, which is a very high-profile, mainstream example of This is why mental health outreach is really important. I think that outreach is kind of like the next step after mental health advocacy, where like you're not just talking about the issues and sharing about the issues, but you're also taking it to the level where you're potentially even like going out to a community like Penn State and actually talking about like, okay, yes, like this is what it is, and you know, like hopefully we can foster a larger dialogue surrounding it and move social progress forward. I have some statistics and information up here about why mental health advocacy and especially mental health outreach is so important. I know that this is very saddening, very heavy, but it's important that we do mention that suicide is a leading cause of death in the United States. It's a problem that's actually gotten significantly worse over the last couple of decades. You can see this data from the CDC's website up here. This was where it was at around 1999 or 2000, and this is the upward trend in suicide rates across the United States over the last 25 years. Very, very sobering. It's a complex, multifaceted public health crisis that we're really still trying to figure out, like, hey, how can we stop these tragedies from happening? I have a couple of examples down here of how suicide rates vary across different populations. One interesting thing to point out, and I think this is probably more common knowledge for psychology students, but I'm sure you all have heard like men are more likely to complete suicide, women are more likely to attempt suicide. So I think that that's very interesting as well. Another example is that young adults are impacted by suicide at a higher rate than other populations are. So it's actually one of the top 3 leading causes of death for young adults. Of course, suicide is not the only negative outcome from unaddressed or ignored mental illness. Other negative outcomes could include homelessness. Maybe you lose your job due to a mental health crisis and you find yourself living on the street. That is a reality for a lot of people in our society. Or maybe you are using, this is an example that I'll tell you more about on future slides, but using drugs or narcotics to self-medicate for your symptoms, which can lead to even worse problems, right? So just think about those things as well, including, of course, equally importantly, strained interpersonal relationships, people losing their families or their friends due to mental illness. So I'll tell you about one example of a serious mental illness. Like I said at the beginning of this presentation, I was going to share one example. So the example that I'm going to focus on for today is bipolar disorder. Like I said, I live with bipolar disorder type 1, which is considered a serious mental illness. Bipolar disorder, often abbreviated as BD, that's the official abbreviation. You may also see it sometimes referred to as BP or BPD, which are not the actual correct terms. So if you're presenting, or like if you're ever talking to someone that's from like a formal, such as yourself, so like when I come out to universities, I always make sure that I call it BD, just so there's no confusion. Now, this is a mood disorder characterized by prolonged elevated manic and or hypomanic episodes. Those mood episodes last for days or weeks at a time, sometimes even months at a time. They're not like a day-to-day like fluctuation where you may be having a manic episode at like 7 in the morning and then a major depressive episode at 9 p.m. That's not how bipolar disorder is typically described in the literature. So those longer episodes can be very detrimental to life functioning. There are two categories, primary categories of BD that we're going to focus on for this presentation, and it's type 1, which is what I live with, and type 2. Here's the difference. Type 1 involves full manic episodes. A manic episode is an acutely elevated mood that interferes with life functioning and lasts most of the day, nearly every day, for 7 days or longer, often associated with increased energy levels, insomnia, erratic behavior, euphoria or dysphoria, anxiety, racing thoughts, irritability, basically feeling like really, really amped up. And it's not necessarily as simple as thinking about being in a good mood or a particularly happy mood. From my own individual experience, the way I describe mania to people is feeling like very stimulated. Like if you could imagine if you haven't slept in a couple of days and you've just been drinking a bunch of coffee or something like that, something like that. It's a very like high-strung, kind of like nervous energy.
It's not a good feeling.
It's not a good feeling, at least not for me, okay? Now, hypomania is distinct from mania in terms of it does also involve elevated mood, but it's not necessarily, well, it's not so bad that it could land you in a mental hospital or something very extreme of that nature. So is it concerning? Yes. Is it problematic? Like it can be, but it just doesn't get quite as extreme as a full manic episode would. Now, in bipolar disorder type 2, I told you there was a difference. Bipolar disorder type 2 only involves hypomanic episodes and major depressive episodes. There is not full, what we kind of informally call full bore mania present in bipolar disorder type 2. Major depressive episodes are probably, maybe people can relate to these a little bit more easily than mania. For some reason it just seems like easier for people to kind of wrap their heads around, but that would be dramatically lowered mood that lasts most of the day, nearly every day, for 2 weeks or longer. That's usually associated with fatigue, insomnia, or hypersomnia, feelings of apathy, worthlessness, maybe even suicidality in extreme cases, right? So that's just a broad level overview of bipolar disorder type 1 and type 2. Psychotic features are present for some people with bipolar disorder type 1 or type 2. Not everybody, but like for using myself as an example, I have bipolar disorder type 1 with psychotic features, meaning that during mood episodes, sometimes I've experienced psychosis, which is essentially breaks with reality. So actually, let me backtrack 1 second. Psychosis involves delusions and or hallucinations. Delusions are more like thoughts, so like false thoughts or beliefs that seem very, very fixed. So that could be, for example, believing that you're a messiah, like delusions of grandeur, just to use one example. And then hallucinations are false sensory perceptions. So that would be those stories you hear about where maybe someone's like hearing voices or seeing things that aren't there. Of course, I always like to highlight that hallucinations can also involve like smells that aren't there, or like feeling physically touched by something that isn't there, which I think is just quite interesting, you know. And that's not the case. So psychosis does not necessarily indicate that a person is dangerous or dysphoric. There are a form of delusions and hallucinations that are called or referred to as being egosyntonic, which means that it's in line with like your overall self-concept and worldview. And some people who experience psychosis can actually find it to be comforting. There's a friend of mine who has bipolar, and she told me about, on my podcast, this isn't like private, she shared it on my show, but she was talking about how like sometimes she would hear voices telling her like funny jokes when she was starting to feel really stressed out. And I thought that that was like a really kind of like funny flip side of what is typically described as applying to psychosis. Here's a bit more about my personal journey with mental illness. A large part of why I do these outreach events is to kind of like share the personal angle as well. This is a photo from when I was in high school. I included that because I realized as I was putting this latest presentation together that my journey with psychiatry and professional mental health treatment really began when I was a kid. And I didn't, like, historically in previous presentations I've done, I didn't really think to incorporate that. But it's interesting because in the year 2000, when I was about 7, I was diagnosed with ADHD. I was prescribed, Ritalin, like stimulant ADHD medication for a very long time growing up. These days, at age 33, I wonder if that may have impacted the course of my experience with mental illness throughout my life. I was an AP scholar and varsity athlete in high school. I used to do crew in high school. That's my varsity crew photo. So I did pretty well academically, and in terms of extracurricular involvement, I was able to get into Penn State, et cetera, et cetera. But also, in those days, like my junior and senior year of high school, I of course began experimenting with alcohol and marijuana like my friends were, on weekends and stuff like that, which was, at least just for me, kind of actually, in retrospect, foreshadowed much more serious substance abuse problems that I would have as an adult. In fall 2011, I enrolled at Penn State. That was my freshman year. I started having major depressive episodes around the spring semester of my sophomore year. So freshman year went pretty smoothly. I was having like a really fun time, going out, getting to learn the Penn State community, like experience the town, like all that was great. But then in spring 2013, I started having like these really bad depressive episodes where I could like barely make it to class. I would go to class, I would get back home, and I would often, excessively use alcohol or other drugs to actually self-medicate for issues I was having with like insomnia and anxiety, things like that. And that made my overall symptoms a lot worse over time. By my senior year, fall 2014, so I graduated a semester early, and so that final semester I was at Penn State in the fall semester of 2014, I started actually experiencing hypomania for the first time. And people with bipolar disorder type 1 can also have hypomania. That's not exclusive only to bipolar disorder type 2, right? So I started having these like initial hypomanic episodes during that final semester year, and it was taking on these like almost like weirdly positive forms in some way. I was getting really hyper-focused on my academic research. I was doing like my senior capstone project at the time. I was studying personality assessments, and I got really obsessed with the research. And so in that way, it was actually productive. It was like conducive to graduating college. But the problem was by the end of the semester, as I started having like these like maybe 1 or 2 week periods where I was like really, really engaged and like really getting hyper into it, my behavior was starting to also become more erratic. So like other students and faculty who I knew up here actually would like, by the end of the semester, people would sometimes be like, hey man, like you're talking like kind of loudly, and like you've been like talk, like are you cool, like what's up? Just people, not in like a mean way, but just people being like, hey dude, like you're really loud right now. And that's actually a common symptom of hypomania, believe it or not. Now, by the time I graduated Penn State, I decided that I wanted to take a little kind of road trip, a little vacation, after I graduated to, just kind of celebrate and unwind and all that good stuff. So that brings us to January 2015, when I was 21 years old. That's an era of my life that I call in my books the Bipolar Odyssey, because it was quite the saga. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time going into it right now. If you guys would like to ask any questions during the Q&A, we can definitely do that. And this has also been explored really extensively in my books. So anyway, the important takeaways are that after I graduated from Penn State, I moved back to my parents' place in Northern Virginia, and then I went on this road trip. New Orleans, Louisiana is down here. So from Virginia, I was supposed to just drive here, but by the time I was in New Orleans, I was really manic. It was no longer hypomania. It had gotten more intense. I was having extremely bad problems with insomnia and goal-directed behavior, where I just wanted to keep driving to the next town and driving to the next town, and that kept stacking and stacking until it got to the point where I found myself up in Montana in the dead of winter, completely disoriented, having psychotic symptoms, hearing voices. I thought that around the time I was passing through Colorado, actually, I started coming under this impression that I was being observed by unmanned aerial vehicles and stuff. And it was really, really creepy. I managed to make it back to Virginia, actually with the help of my father. My dad, on this emergency father-son rescue mission, was able to rendezvous with me in Wisconsin, and he helped me drive that final stretch back to Virginia. And honestly, thank God that he did, because I could have easily gotten into a fatal car accident or something, or gotten arrested somehow, that kind of stuff. But by the time I got back to Northern Virginia, I was really out of it. Even though I was back with my family, I was just so irritable and sleep deprived and losing it, that my parents, within about 24 hours, were once we got back to their house and I was with my parents and my brothers, my parents kind of strong-armed me into seeing a psychiatrist as a condition of living with them because of, just my behavior and the concerns that they had. So I started working with a psychiatrist in February 2015. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 1 after a couple of appointments with that psychiatrist. I began taking psychiatric medication as an adult after seeing that psychiatrist, but I wasn't taking the pills as prescribed, and that actually, I think, made my symptoms a lot worse. I was hospitalized for my mental health crisis, my manic mental health crisis, in May 2015. That was a civil commitment in the state of Virginia, meaning that I was required by a judge. I was detained by police, taken to a hospital, did this weird pseudo court hearing at the hospital, and then I was required to stay there for 5 days, something like that. It was a very traumatic experience. It was not conducive to getting my life back on track. By the time I got out of the hospital, even though I was in there for a relatively brief period of time, I was so just skeptical of professional mental health treatment. So I stopped taking my medication, and I fell into this really bad depression for the most of the rest of that summer. In late summer 2015, I realized that I seriously needed to do something to get my life back on track. I couldn't believe that less than a year before, I was a top performing student here at Penn State, and then within less than a year, I'm in a psych ward, literally in a psych ward, living in my parents' basement, just wondering, what am I doing with my life? And so I asked myself that a lot, and I realized what would be good for me is to start volunteering in my community. So I began doing volunteer work at a mental health clinic in my parents' town for about 20 to 30 hours a week, each week, for the rest of that summer. I used that experience to bolster my resume, and then I was able to pivot into full-time paid work with a social services agency in Virginia. And that's how my career path started. So I worked let me tell you a bit about that. That brings us to Bipolar Recorder Project. This is my independent mental health outreach organization that I've been working on officially since October 2021. But before Bipolar Recorder was even a thing, I was writing articles and books about mental health recovery. In 2016, after I had started my career in social services, I also stopped drinking alcohol and using drugs. I actually got fully 100% stone sober for about 4 years. After that, not even using marijuana or anything like that, which anyway, it was a process. But throughout this time, I started writing about addiction recovery and harm reduction articles. One of those articles was published by National Alliance on Mental Illness in December 2019, and that inspired me to write my first memoir, My Brain is Trying to Kill Me, and that was published in June 2020. So leading into Bipolar Recorder Project, I had that pre-existing body of work, and then people started talking to me about wanting to do a podcast, and then the podcast launched. That came along with an online mental health peer support community that I was able to cultivate through networking with other mental health advocates. So for a few years, we had a really popular community on Twitter, or X Spaces. Do any of you guys know what that is? Have you heard of Spaces? Okay, they're live audio chat rooms where basically they're public chat rooms and people can host them, and anyone from anywhere can just tune in and talk. And so we started using that as a format for mental health peer support. And it was really successful. In 2023, in October, I started doing the university outreach. In 2024, we put out a short documentary film about Bipolar Recorder and the peer support community. And that was called Exploring New Frontiers for Mental Health Support. That's on our YouTube channel, if anyone would like to check it out. And Dr. Weimer,
posted it on Canvas.
yes, and the link is on your Canvas site as well. And then the last thing I'll say about that is I continue to try to put out as much quality content as I can related to all of this. My most recent book is called Happy Valleys, A Bipolar Journey, and that was published last February. It's available on Amazon, and I'm also working on an audiobook edition. So I'm just going to spend a few more minutes wrapping up here, and then we're going to open the floor for a Q&A session. Now, I want to keep a couple of things in mind before we transition into the Q&A, but do recall, suicide remains an active public health crisis in the United States. This is an issue that is taking more lives every day, like each year, and so it's very, very urgent that we start finding new approaches to help, resolve that. I also point out that there are many large-scale advocacy organizations that many of us have heard about, like NAMI. If you recall, NAMI was an organization that published one of my articles, right? And so what I started learning about them over time, though, is they do take large amounts of funding from pharmaceutical companies. They're very vague these days on their exact funding sources. And for me, as someone who I'm skeptical, I think critically, it makes me question who they're really trying to foster progress for, if that makes sense. And I think that's a fair statement about them. For people with serious mental illness or who are experiencing mental health crisis events, professional support can be intrusive and even dangerous. I think I forgot to bring this up on the earlier slide, but there were a number of police interactions that I had during the spring and late winter of 2015 that were, they could have resulted very badly. People get injured by police on mental health calls all the time, even killed by police on mental health calls. Then, of course, there's the whole aspect of forced psychiatric medication and treatment, that civil commitment I was on in Virginia. Ethically, I have a lot of reservations about how that played out. So ask yourselves this, should a court of law ever be allowed to require someone to take a medication? It's just a general question that could kind of guide us during the Q&A session. And then finally, this is actually related to the forced medication thing, but just involuntary and coerced inpatient hospitalization. A lot of people find those experiences to be very traumatic, but these are still referred to as like the solution for people who are having really, really tough times with mental health. And I think that with it being the year 2026 and the amount of resources and potential funding that are available, I think that whole institution of inpatient psychiatry should be reevaluated and improved and reformed. All right, so I'm going to leave y'all with this. We call community the third element of mental health recovery. For Bipolar Recorder Project, that's something we talked about in our documentary. For those of you who are familiar with the periodic table of elements, the third element is actually lithium, which I did not, actually didn't know that when we came up with that, but then I realized, I was like, oh, that's actually pretty funny. So the medication lithium is the third element in the periodic table of elements. Our third element is community. So you have professional treatment, so that would be like medication and therapy. What else do you need? Community, the third element. Boom. So what factors are impacting you and your peers' mental health, good or bad, in your community? What kind of supportive resources do you think would be helpful, and what do those look like? And then finally, this question is a little bit different, but I thought it was important to include. How do you want to be thought of by your community. Like, as a member of this society, what are you going for? You know, and what do you think would be a way that you would like to be remembered? You know, just food for thought. Let me go to this final slide. With that, I am concluding the presentation, but I would really be happy to answer any questions or respond to any comments that any of you all may have. I've also brought these small merch kits just to hand out to the first few people who have questions. If you would like a free short, this is one of the earlier books that I put out. It's a short story, and we've also got a cool sticker and a business card. So thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate you coming out on a Friday afternoon too. Would anyone like to pose a... Yeah, what's your question?
So I work at a psychiatric center for adolescents. Don't love my job, love what I do.
Okay.
What are your kind of thoughts on the group therapeutic setting for especially people that have like bipolar disorder and stuff like that, especially for young children, I guess?
Yeah, I don't really have a ton of experience or familiarity with like the research on adolescent or like early childhood. I'll say actually for bipolar disorder, I know that it's considered by some psychiatrists to be kind of a controversial diagnosis for younger people. But I think what I would say is group therapy is known to be really helpful for many individuals, and I'm certainly never trying to turn people away from something that could help, even if that does look like, you know, emergency care at a hospital or a clinic. You know, for some people that does help. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I know when I was inpatient in 2015, the therapy groups at the hospital...
I did groups for adults, but we couldn't do groups for children because it was mostly substance use related. And so if anybody's under 18, it's considered not a good thing to have them be around other substances because they can, you know, meet a new drug dealer or something.
Yeah.
But so for people over 18, the most effective treatment is actually group treatment for substance use. But for children, I think one-on-one is the best.
That's awesome.
Personally.
And of course, Dr. Weimer is our resident psychologist. And
Not
so
psychiatrist. Even my own wife calls me psychiatrist.
So thank you for your question, though. I do hope that more forms of therapy, like more therapy formats, are explored. And you know, what works for one person may not work so well for another. So just the more options available, the better, in my opinion. Okay. Cool.
If you want to talk more about this in future classes, we can.
Yeah, excellent question. Would you like a book? Yes. What is your question?
So I'm actually very familiar with bipolar disorder.
Okay.
My mother has bipolar type 1.
Okay.
And I hear this often both in classes and just seeing it through experience. Why do you think people that are diagnosed with bipolar have such a difficult time taking their medication or like consistently staying with treatment?
Well, because the medication can be harmful to some people is part of it.
Bad side effects.
Bad side effects for some individuals. Some of the medications can feel extremely sedating, and people do not necessarily want to feel that way. Conversely, some people do benefit from medication, and so it may be easier for those individuals to stay on it consistently. I have a very, just as an individual, and I should say everything I state during these presentations is my individual perspective, right? And based on my life experience. But I've been on medications before that did have really bad side effects, and I was like, why am I taking this? You know, it seems to be making my life objectively worse in many areas. But that is the status quo. For many people with serious mental illness, the status quo is to like take the prescribed psych meds, and that's what you have to do. And so that's why we introduced that third concept of the element of community as well. You know, because that also can help people find support. Does that help? Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. That's a great question though, and that comes up a lot. And as I was saying before, you know, what works for one person may not work for another. So Do we have a question up here? Yeah, and back here too. We'll get to you next.
You said you had some negative experience with the police and how they
Yeah.
interacted with you. What do you recommend that they could do better, and like how do you think they could have treated the situation, or like
Not be narcissistic.
Yeah, like not be there. Like just don't come. Like, no, I mean, I had my interactions with police were really weird because I'm very articulate and I was able to talk my way out of like 4 out of 5 police attempts at like detaining me and taking me to a hospital. But the other thing I do keep in mind is like, actually, sorry, I was about to kind of like pivot into like some other topic that wasn't exactly what you asked me, but like cops have an incredibly difficult job, right? Like for sure, and their priority when they respond to mental health calls is like solve this emergency as quickly as possible so we can go on and like keep the rest of the community safe. So like cops are not therapists, and you know the thing I was told by cops is, oh, we really want to help you, we'd like to help people, and I'm like, bullshit, like get out of here. What could be done differently? I would say have law enforcement less involved with mental health care. If it's truly a mental health issue, have it handled by mental health professionals. If it's a criminal matter where someone may be dangerous towards someone else, then police would, unfortunately need to be involved with that.
do you think they need more training on like mental health?
Maybe
I
mental
do.
health training, yeah.
Yeah, I think mental health training helps a little bit. I also wonder how much of a benefit it really is, because it's a difference between being in this classroom and then being out on the street. You know, in theory, training sounds great. In practice, will it make a difference? Hopefully, yes. So I would say, yeah, sure. Why not? More mental health training for first responders? Absolutely.
Then I have another question. Is there any like memory loss in between like episodes? Like if like you're in a manic episode and then or like depressive, like would you remember anything you did?
Yeah.
Everything?
Not necessarily everything. That's like a very individual specific question. I was told by a therapist who I used to work with. I actually worked with her for many years. I worked with her for like 7 or 8 years. She was great. But she told me that what I described in our therapy sessions was actually like unusually detailed in terms of the memory recall from the psychotic episodes that I had. My therapist told me that many people who have manic psychosis do have like gaps.
I was surprised to hear you say that Native Americans are one of the top 2 at-risk groups for suicide. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I'm
Alcohol.
Okay.
Is a big problem.
Yeah.
Alcohol,
yeah.
hypermasculinity.
I'll say when I was out in Wyoming, I accidentally was driving through a lot of large reservation areas, and I remember I was not even diagnosed with bipolar at the time, but I was going through these small towns and like meeting local people living there, and I remembered, man, this seems like kind of a depressing place. So I couldn't tell you exactly why. I'm sure there are many socioeconomic, genetic, like all sorts of factors. Yeah.
Stereotypes as well. Do they just look down on mental health?
Perhaps.
Some cultures. That's why Guyana has the world's highest suicide rate, because mental health is very stigmatized there.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up though, because it's a fantastic question, and we should be researching more about this. So perhaps, are you planning on going to grad school or anything? No? Well, I didn't go to grad school. Even with your bachelor's degree, you know, you do have, by the time you graduate here, a very good, you will, if you don't already, have a good grasp on how to read academic research articles and stuff. And you can still interpret that. Okay, and finally, over here.
I remember you saying when you were talking about how you were diagnosed with ADHD that you suspected perhaps that maybe the medication you were on maybe had a negative impact on your mental health going forward. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on that and what your thoughts are on like medication for young
Yeah, I'm just, for me, speaking as someone who's not a doctor and is not trying to, comment on other people's medical situations, to me, it just seems wild to put, a 5-year-old on amphetamines every day. And so, as an adult, I was working with my current psychiatrist. I had an appointment with him recently, and as an adult, I've on and off taken Adderall at certain points, and I'm currently off of it. And he told me the most recent time when I was kind of seeing about going back on it, and I'm just speaking about myself, but he mentioned that historically, it's been recently discovered in the literature that people were on very high doses, higher doses than they needed to be on.
Mm-hmm. It's a common problem.
Overdose, so for those reasons, and especially with my experience with substance abuse problems as an adult and adolescent, it seems like something that should be looked into, right? Or if I was able to look into it and get some real answers, then.
The best practices are for psychiatrists to give the minimum effective dose, especially
Right.
for antipsychotics, but they're pressured by pharmaceutical drug reps.
Yeah.
They're really pressured by drug reps who bring them free Olive Garden and free Red Lobster and all these other things. So they're pressured to over-medicate, unfortunately. And a thing that made me think about something, I think an underrated factor in a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is liability risk.
Yes.
I think liability risk leads to stigma.
Mm.
And for example, somebody who's suicidal. Most people in the law enforcement world, they see them as I don't want to get sued, so let me pass the buck. I don't want to get sued if this person dies, so let me pass the buck. So that happens a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't know how much time we have left, but I just wanted to say thank you all so much for coming out. I hope this was beneficial, Alright, thank you all for listening to this installment number 73 of the Bipolar Recorder Podcast. My name is Hunter Keegan. Support this project at bipolarrecorder.com/shop. Remember to follow us on Instagram, YouTube, X, at Bipolar Recorder. You can contact me at hunterhkeegan@gmail.com or through the web form on bipolarrecorder.com. Thanks so much for listening. Have a wonderful and productive day, evening, or night, wherever you are. Bipolar Recorder is a listener-supported show. To help keep the show running, consider checking out our Patreon page or visiting bipolarrecorder.com.
Unless otherwise stated, the hosts and guests on Bipolar Recorder are not licensed mental health professionals. Bipolar Recorder is not a substitute for therapy or professional medical intervention. If you are having a mental health crisis, please contact your local emergency services.